The Rio de Janeiro Massacre, the largest police operation in Brazil's history. Brazil woke up in shock. The headlines on October 28, 2025, showed images that looked like scenes of war. Helicopters flying over favelas, armored vehicles in the streets, bodies covered with white sheets, and desperate residents crying for help. Rio de Janeiro, one of the world's most famous cities, known for its carnival, beaches, and joyful people, had become the stage for the largest police operation in its recent history. More than 119 people were killed in clashes between security forces and the Comando Vermelho, the main criminal faction in the region. What began as an operation to arrest drug traffickers turned into an episode of urban violence that sparked national outrage and international condemnation. Before understanding what happened that day, it is necessary to go back a little in time. For decades, Rio de Janeiro has faced a public security crisis marked by the presence of criminal factions that control entire communities. The Comando Vermelho, founded in the 1970s, established itself as one of the most powerful organizations in the country, with branches in other states and even neighboring countries. In recent years, the struggle for control of drug, arms, and territorial routes has intensified, especially in the complexes of Penha, Alemão, Marais, and Manguinhos. These areas are densely populated and difficult to access, making any police incursion extremely dangerous. According to the authorities, the operation was planned after months of monitoring. The goal was to capture drug lords and destroy the Comando Vermelho's weapons and drug warehouses. However, according to later reports, the planning did not take into account the massive civilian presence in the targeted areas. During the night of October 27 to 28, around 2,500 security agents, including military police, civil police, and army personnel, were mobilized. The armored helicopter Caveirão Aéreo hovered over the northern zone, while convoys of tactical vehicles advanced through narrow streets and steep hills. The state government stated that the main target was a group of heavily armed traffickers who had attacked a patrol car days earlier. However, residents reported that gunfire began even before dawn, catching many by surprise without any chance to escape. As the sun rose, drone and cell phone footage showed columns of smoke rising from the favelas and helicopters firing at locations considered strategic by the factions. The operation quickly spread, hitting several communities simultaneously. Between 6 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, Rio lived through a true hell. According to The Guardian, the clashes left at least 64 dead in the first hours, including 4 police officers. The number grew as more bodies were found by rescue teams and by residents themselves. The streets were filled with barricades, burning tires, and houses hit by stray bullets. Residents took refuge in schools, churches, and community centers. Ambulances struggled to enter the most affected areas, and many of the wounded died without medical care. Videos posted on social media showed people screaming for help as helicopters continued to fly overhead and shoot. Some residents tried to wave white flags to signal that only civilians were there. By the end of the day, the balance released by the state government indicated 119 dead, 81 people arrested, and dozens of weapons seized. Governor Claudio Castro declared in a press conference that the action was a success against organized crime, and that the state would not retreat in the face of terror imposed by the factions. However, the images that followed showed another reality. Bodies left in the streets, residents transporting the dead in wheelbarrows, and reports of summary executions. Organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Rio Public Defender's Office began collecting testimonies from families who claimed to have lost unarmed relatives. In the hours that followed, civil entities and journalists began to gather evidence suggesting that part of the deaths may have occurred after the direct confrontations had ended. There were reports of people being captured and executed, homes invaded without warrants, and bodies removed from hospitals without proper identification. Residents stated that agents destroyed cell phones and prevented filming. The Public Defender's Office requested an independent investigation and the dispatch of UN international observers. The state government, however, maintained its position, claiming that all deaths occurred during armed confrontation and that no innocent civilians were executed. In Brasilia, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's government adopted a cautious tone. The Ministry of Justice declared that it follows the events in Rio de Janeiro with concern and expects transparency in the investigations. Lula personally avoided criticizing the governor, saying that public security is a state responsibility. Behind the scenes, however, Planalto advisors expressed fear of negative international repercussions, especially because Brazil will host COP30, the United Nations Climate Conference. The news quickly spread abroad. Outlets such as the BBC, CNN, and Reuters described the episode as the bloodiest day in Rio in decades. The Guardian published the headline, "Rio is at war." The United Nations issued a statement requesting formal explanations from the Brazilian government about the use of force and respect for human rights. Amnesty International stated that no fight against crime justifies executions, torture, or disappearances. In several Latin American and European capitals, demonstrations were organized in front of Brazilian embassies, demanding an end to police violence and protection for favela residents. In the following days, what most caught attention were the images of residents themselves carrying dozens of bodies to a square in Penha in protest. Women, children, and the elderly united to denounce what they called a massacre. Banners read, "There is no war here, this is genocide." Community leaders reported that many bodies were still missing, possibly taken away in armored vehicles without official records. Some families had been searching for relatives for more than 48 hours with no information from police stations or hospitals. Fear spread throughout the communities. Classes were suspended in more than 50 public schools, and health centers remained closed. Residents reported traumatized children, elderly people without access to medication, and entire families who left their homes for safety. Volunteer psychologists and humanitarian organizations entered the affected areas to provide emotional and social support. The Archdiocese of Rio and several evangelical churches opened their doors to shelter displaced families. In response to criticism, the Rio Military Police stated that their agents were met with heavy gunfire and that the operation saved lives by preventing heavily armed criminals from attacking other communities. According to the PM command, the traffickers used high-caliber rifles and military grenades. Videos released by the government showed seized weapons and drug depots, as well as imported uniforms and ammunition. These images were used to justify the intensity of the action. Governor Claudio Castro declared, "Rio will not be held hostage by criminals. We will reclaim every street, every hill, and every community. There is no democratic rule of law when citizens live under the control of traffickers." The episode reignited an old debate in Brazil. How can crime be fought without violating human rights? Security experts claim that operations like this do not solve the structural problem, as factions quickly reorganize. They advocate investment in intelligence, education, and social opportunities to reduce the power of drug trafficking. On the other hand, more conservative sectors of society support tough actions, arguing that the state must show strength in the face of criminal advances. This division reflects the political polarization the country has experienced since 2016. The Rio State Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation into the deaths, and the civil police began identifying the victims. So far, more than half of the bodies have been recognized, many of them young people aged between 17 and 25. Human rights organizations demand that the case be taken to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights if there is no impartial investigation. The federal government promised to monitor the process but not intervene directly. The reaction across the country was immediate. On social media, politicians and citizens were divided between those who supported and those who condemned the operation. The hashtag #Massacre da Penha became one of the most discussed topics on Brazilian Twitter. TV programs, radio shows, and newspapers debated for days whether the state was protecting the population or repeating a historical pattern of violence against the poor. Opinion polls showed that most residents of Rio's wealthier neighborhoods approved of the operation, while those living in the peripheries considered it disproportionate and inhumane. Days after the clashes, the scene was still one of devastation. Houses riddled with bullets, streets scarred by explosions, and families still trying to identify missing loved ones. The city entered an unofficial state of mourning. Although the government announced a temporary pacification, reports indicated that criminals returned to some areas just days later. The absence of social policies and fear of repression made coexistence even more tense. The episode shook Brazil's international image. The country, which seeks to present itself as a democratic and environmental leader in Latin America, began to be questioned for state violence and lack of institutional control. Brazilian diplomats in Geneva and New York had to respond to UN and European inquiries about police actions. Reuters highlighted that public security has become one of President Lula da Silva's biggest challenges. For many experts, the October 2025 massacre represents a turning point in Rio de Janeiro's history. It is the portrait of a country that has not yet managed to reconcile social justice and security. The favelas remain spaces of resistance, culture, and life, but also of exclusion and neglect. And while the state does not arrive with education, employment, and citizenship, the cycle of violence will continue to repeat itself. What happened in Rio de Janeiro was not merely a police operation. It was a mirror of a much deeper problem, the social abyss and inequality that divide Brazil. Over 100 dead, shattered families, and a traumatized city. While the government speaks of victory, thousands of residents speak of mourning. And the world watches, questioning how far the fight against crime can go in justifying such violence. The future of Rio, and of Brazil itself, will depend on how this tragedy is remembered, as an act of war or as an urgent call for peace and justice. GeoPulse, your source of information today, tomorrow, and always. Follow the channel and share the video.